All right, I know this is a shock to everybody, but we're on chapter 4 this evening.
Boy, moving right along.
But now that Mario said that, that reminds me, I wanted to go back and cover something else in chapter 3.
Shocker.
Shocker?
Yeah.
All right, chapter 4, verse 1. This begins the story of the next generation. Of course, up until this point, we've talked about Adam and Eve and their punishment and a little bit about what has happened to them. But nothing has been said about the second generation and what would now be the first generation brought up in sin. Now, it might be noted at this point, and you might think this is an obvious statement here, but it's worth looking at because so many people always ask this question. Where'd Cain get his wife from? Or for any of them for that matter. We're told here in chapter 4, which we'll read here in just a moment, that Cain and Abel were born, and then later Seth. And all it says, in fact, we won't find this until we get to chapter 5. It just says Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. And people have asked over the years, well, if Cain was exiled, and it says Cain went with his wife, where did his wife come from? And they have theorized that somehow God created another race, or that Adam and Eve were not the only ones that God created. But here's the big problem with that assumption. First of all, it would go directly against what Scripture tells us. The Bible tells us point blank, all humanity descended from whom? Adam and Eve. So if God created somebody else, then the Bible would be wrong. That there would be other DNA involved in this. Doesn't say that. It says everybody descended from Adam and Eve. The second thing we run into is if in fact God had created other people, if Adam and Eve fell, that wouldn't have affected anybody else. They would still have been in innocence. So you'd essentially have two races of humanity, a sinful race and an innocent race. We don't see any evidence of that at all. All we see is an entire human race inundated with sin, which tells us one thing. The Bible is correct. There's only one race of humanity. Everybody descended from Adam and Eve. So now, as we get into this, where did Cain or any of the rest of his kids get their wives? We've talked about this at least twice before, but just as a reminder, back then, there was no prohibition to marry your own brother or sister. We don't do that now because God, from the time of Moses forward, prohibited it because of mutations and defects in our DNA. In that day and age, only one or two generations removed from creation itself, how many defects would the human genome have had in it?
Not many.
Yeah, virtually none, with the exception of sin itself. So marrying your sister wouldn't have produced a problem child. So that's where Cain got his wife. So now that also will come into play when we get down to chapter 6 and we see this description of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Just for right now, just keep that under your hat and remember that we're going to run into that later. Verse 1, it says, now the man, and if you're reading from a King James, it will say that Adam knew his wife. If you read from some of the more modern translations, it says the man, or Adam, had relations with his wife Eve. The word in Hebrew that is correctly translated in the King James, that Adam knew his wife, is a word that does not mean that he cognitively knew her. It means he had carnal knowledge of her. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. He had sex with his wife, same way any other kid's born. Then had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I've gotten a man-child. Now, if you're reading this, how many of you see that the words, the help of, gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord, the help of is in italics? Any of you?
The help of, yeah, is in
Uh-huh.
italics.
All right, what does that mean? Anybody remember?
Added for clarity.
Added for clarity. Literally what the Hebrew says is, I've gotten a man-child with the Lord. Or it can be translated, a man-child of the Lord. Now I'll explain to you why that...
How about from the Lord? Yeah, that's what I had.
Yeah, could be, but it's in a what's called in Hebrew a construct case, which literally it reads, I've gotten a man-child, the Lord. That's literally what it says. Of or the or from is all understood based on what in Hebrew is called a construct. Let me explain what that means. In English, if we want to make a possessive, we've got two ways of saying it, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody know?
Of so-and-so.
Of so-and-so,
Or
or
so-and-so's.
so-and-so, apostrophe S, whatever. In Hebrew, they don't have that. If you put two nouns together, for example,
That's a noun?
as in two nouns together,
Like William Carr.
Brenda is Lou wife. That's the way they would put it, which of course,
Sounds dorky to us.
yeah, it sounds dorky to us, but that's perfectly good in Hebrew. And what is Brenda? Lou's wife. We put apostrophe S. In Hebrew, they would just say Lou wife, which means, that Lou of something.
So a construct is kind of like the way when we're watching something that's a British program, they don't use the word the, like they're going to the hospital, they say they're going to hospital, and that's just the structure that they do it in.
And if you said in English, we say the light of the morning. In Hebrew, they would have just said light morning. It would be understood that that's light of the morning. That's literally what it says here. In the original Hebrew, it says, I've gotten a man-child, the Lord. So you can see some translations may say of the Lord, others from the Lord, and then there's some like my New American Standard that puts in here in italics with the help of the Lord. It's all a matter of how you translate it. Now, let me explain why that's important. What was the promise that God gave to Eve right after she sinned?
She would have pain and
Greatly
childbirth.
increase your pain.
No, that's not a promise. Well, that was a
Well,
punishment.
I think it was a promise that that's what's going to happen.
But what was the promise?
Kids.
That was a commandment. Be fruitful and multiply.
But the mother of the...
Yeah, it said, your seed will put enmity, I'll put enmity between your seed and the seed of the serpent. That was the promise. Some theologians believe, and there is evidence of this, depending on how you translate the Hebrew, that what Eve is saying when Cain was born is that she may have at that point thought Cain is the fulfillment of God's promise. That I've gotten a man-child of the Lord. She was basically saying that, well, God promised that my seed was going to deal with this, and then when Cain is her firstborn, there's some that believe, and again, there is that possibility, she thought Cain was a fulfillment of that promise, which of course it didn't take her too long to figure out that wasn't the case. But to her credit, if that's what she thought, what would that have told you about Eve's position with regard to her salvation? No, actually it would have been a positive thing. It meant that she trusted God's promise. She might have misinterpreted it, but if that's the correct translation, she trusted that what God had told her was going to come true. And in the Old Testament, before the coming of the Messiah, how was salvation established?
Faith.
Faith in
God.
promise. Faith in the promise. We look back on it in faith of promise fulfilled. They looked forward to faith in the promise that would be fulfilled. Still based on faith, the only difference is which direction on the timeline are you looking. We look back to the cross. They were looking forward to, they didn't know it was going to be a cross, but they looked forward to God fulfilling that promise. If this is true, and Eve was saying, I've gotten a man-child of the Lord, she's essentially saying that she thought God had fulfilled his promise. She just turned out to be wrong as to how soon it was going to happen. That's one possibility. The other possibility, which we actually looked at here, what was it, Sunday or last one? I think it was Sunday. Those that believe that it's correctly translated, I've gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord, would prove to us what? If that's the correct translation, then God himself was the first, what?
Midwife.
Midwife. Either way, do you think that she gave birth to her first child not knowing anything at all about, birthing no babies? That she did it all by herself? Or do you think that God might very well have stepped in and maybe showed Adam, says, this is how you help her. This is what you do. I mean, how else would they have learned? Remember, we're not animals. Yes, animals figured out by instinct that God instills in them. But how many of you women, if we want to say, oh, well, God instilled in us, how many of you ladies gave birth to a child and knew from instinctively everything you needed to do and basically told the doctor, the midwife, whatever you happen to have, oh, you can go on back home, I'll take care of this myself? Any of you?
I still haven't figured out raising children.
Yeah. Goes back to, what was it, Gone with the Wind? I don't know nothing about birthing no babies. So clearly, God has not put within us the same instinct that he gave animals. We're different. We're people. And so I think while it could be translated that it's a man-child of the Lord, I think there's strong evidence to indicate that the indication here was she had a man-child by or from the Lord, as you mentioned earlier, in implying that God helped out.
I think there's a third interpretation.
Go ahead.
That fits either one of those wordings, that even without God having actually given her physical help in delivering the baby, and her thinking this child is of God, getting a child at all at this point would seem to be a miraculous thing, and it must be from God.
Mm-hmm.
So in that, not seeing it as the prophesied deliverer, but just seeing it as getting a child at all is a miraculous thing.
And that's
and
the
being
possibility.
from God.
Mm-hmm.
So that, God is what puts the life in every child that's born. We don't do it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't the sperm and the egg combining together don't create the child. God does that miraculously for every child that's ever been born. Puts his spirit in them. So to me, that could be the interpretation as well. That
Good possibility.
Simply getting a child at all was a miraculous thing.
Because consider this. If God is not involved in the process, biologically, and let's just, for the sake of arguing the point here, if it were to be possible to become pregnant simply with a combination of a sperm and an egg, and God did not have anything to do with it, God just stepped back and let the biological process continue, what would be the resulting birth? Anybody want to
Stillborn.
Well, maybe.
The sperm and the egg can create a body, but God puts the spirit in it.
All right. But consider this. You got a whole pile of cats at home. Those cats don't have spirits, but yet they're still alive. See, that's my point. I would venture to say that, yes, a child would be born, but it would be no different than an animal without the most important ingredient, a spirit. That's what God puts within us. Because go back to the creation of Adam. What made Adam human versus any different than the animals God had created? What's that? Yes, God put His Spirit in Adam. That is what made Adam different from that's what makes all of us different from the animals. Without a spirit, that's all we are, is flesh and blood, made from the dust of the earth. We'd be nothing more than an animal. And the evolutionists would be correct. What makes us human is not our bodies, it's our spirit. So what you would have, if it were be possible for God not to be involved in the process, is nothing more. They'd give birth to a human that was nothing more than an animal. At least that's my interpretation. But I think you're on the right track there, that it is a miracle in that with every conception, God places His Spirit within that individual. What's that? Oh.
I was just saying here in my Bible, it says here, she conceived and bore, let's see here, bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord.
Same thing, just different. And by the way, when she says man, she's acquired a man-child.
No, just a man.
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying in my translation it says man-child. Yours says man. It is a word in the original Hebrew that does imply an adult maleness. So at that point, by using that terminology, and yours is a good translation there, Eve didn't really probably understand or have a full understanding of what a child was yet, because she did use a word that could be translated as a man. Not a child, but a man. That she's gotten a man from the Lord. And being as that was the first birth ever,
No experience yet.
and
with
no
children.
experience,
That's what I thought.
yeah. All right, we beat that verse to death. Verse 2. And again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now, do you notice here, and there's some linguistic evidence to indicate that this may be the case. Notice in verse 1, it says that Adam knew or had relations with his wife, and she conceived and had Cain. Notice in verse 2, it just says, again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. What's missing here?
It's kind of hard for a woman to get pregnant without a man.
But there is one way it's possible, and I'm not talking about a virgin birth. Say, who said that?
Twins.
There you go.
What?
A lot of people believe that it's possible that Cain and Abel were twin brothers.
Wouldn't have said that though.
But the way, look at just the way it reads. Doesn't say, how many times do we read in the Bible where later on it says, and Adam knew his wife again?
And
Or so-and-so
begat.
knew his wife. It doesn't say that here in verse 2, just says, and again she gave birth. There's strong evidence based on the way this is worded that Cain and Abel may have been twin brothers. Probably never thought of that. Now again, we don't know for sure, but it definitely leaves open this possibility. Now, we often look down on Cain as being the, the black sheep. But at this point in their life, notice what Cain has done compared to his father. Cain basically is Adam Jr. here. What did Adam do for a living?
Work the land.
He worked the land. What's Cain doing?
Working the land.
He's working the land. Abel is the one that was the odd man out. Abel decided to go out and keep the sheep. And at this particular point, again, as I think I mentioned with Larry last Sunday, there's the possibility that at this point humanity might have eaten meat. The evidence biblically is strongly against it. In all probability, based upon what has been revealed to us so far, humanity was still vegetarian at this point. Now notice I didn't say vegan. Anybody know what's the difference between a vegan and a vegetarian? Anybody know?
But vegans,
There you go. Dairy products.
well, and also vegans, won't some vegetarians eat eggs?
Eggs would be, yeah, that's kind of bordering on meat eating.
Yeah.
Because you're still taking the, but yes, a vegan won't even eat dairy products. Butter, milk, ice cream.
Anything
Cheese.
that comes from
Cheese,
an animal.
But a vegetarian will. So the theory is that Abel raised flocks basically for three things. Number one, their skins. Number two, sacrifice. And number three, dairy products. Milk, cheese, butter. Because even if they were vegetarians, they still could eat, consume milk and cheese and things of that sort.
Sheep produce a product you can harvest without killing the sheep as well. Wool.
Well, that's what I'll say. That clothing,
You don't
things
have
of that
to
sort.
you don't have to skin the animal.
Don't
to
have
get
to
the
skin
wool.
the animal.
So-
You can harvest the wool, and not just sheep, goats as well. Apparently, goats actually produce good wool. So it's believed that Abel kept the flocks for this particular reason, but being a keeper of flocks, his sacrifice is a blood sacrifice. Cain is providing fruits. And we're going to probably spend the rest of the time talking about the difference in their two sacrifices, because that's probably been the big theological argument that's been going on for a couple thousand years, is why did God reject Cain's sacrifice? And for every commentary you read, you'll get a different answer. There's two basic camps. One has to do with his attitude. The other has to do with what it was he sacrificed. A third camp says all of the above. So let's look at this. But anyway, it says Cain was a tiller of the ground. So Cain took after his dad. He's the farmer. Verse 3 says, so it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. And Abel on his part also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Now, notice the difference right off the bat between verses 3 and 4. It just says in verse 3, Cain brought an offering, period. In verse 4, it says Cain brought what?
Firstlings.
First fruit. There you go. Cain just brought an offering. We don't know if it was the best, the first. It was just an offering. Could have been the junk he had left over for all we know. The Bible makes it clear here that it wasn't his first fruit. It was just an offering. But Abel, on the other hand, brings the first fruit. And not only the first fruit, notice it says, and of their fat portions. What does that tell you?
Took the best stuff.
Yeah, when you're talking about, do you want to offer a skinny, calf that's ribs are showing through? Or do you offer up a fat one? Which one's the better one?
Healthy one.
Yeah, the one that's healthy, got some meat and fat on his bones. So not only did Abel offer the first of his flocks, he offered the best of them. And when you see in the Old Testament a reference to the fat portions, that's essentially what it's talking about. These were the healthy animals that had some serious meat on them. They weren't the scrawny, sickly ones that were left over. So Cain brings an offering. Abel brings the first fruit and the best of his flock. There's your first biggest difference right there. Now notice out of that, it says in verse 4, the Lord regarded Abel and his offering, but verse 5, God did not accept Cain's offering. Now, as for how they knew God accepted them, I've read commentaries that say that the God miraculously came down and, consumed it. Others that will say, well, maybe Cain and Abel made their offerings at the gate to the Garden of Eden, and the flaming sword miraculously took it. You probably will read any one number of those possibilities. But does the Bible tell us? We don't have a clue. For all we know, God could have spoken to them and said, Cain, unacceptable. Abel, good job. We don't know. So anything that you read about how God might have expressed his regard or lack thereof would be pure speculation. We don't know. But what we do know, when it says Cain became angry and his countenance fell, Cain wasn't happy about it. It says when his countenance fell, what does that sound like to you?
Long in the face.
He pouted. He sat over there and yeah, Cain had a bad attitude. Now that brings us to the second possibility. First possibility is definitely the result of the type of offering. If a blood sacrifice was offered, Cain didn't offer one. Abel did. If Cain was a keeper of the field, if he was a farmer like his dad, how could he have properly offered a blood sacrifice?
Traded
Right.
fruits and things for one.
What's that?
Traded his fruits. and
There you
things.
go. If they got to have food to eat and they're vegetarians at this point, he could have taken his fruit to Abel and said, "Hey, buddy, how about trade me that one right over there for the best of my fruit?" And it probably would have been acceptable.
But there's no specific explanation as to the method of offering that would have been required, though.
Method, we don't know.
That's what I'm saying. It doesn't say it. I mean, we're in the 4th chapter. Obviously, it hasn't happened where we've gotten that info yet.
Nope, we don't know. Now, whether Abel burned his sacrifice on the altar or whether he just sacrificed it, just slit its throat, we have no way of knowing. But we can tell clearly it would not have been a sacrifice if Abel didn't kill it. Now, how do you go about killing fruit?
I think, too, when it reads, Cain really didn't make any effort at all. He just took whatever he had and threw it out.
Probably. Go ahead.
I said pick it, but that's how you kill the fruit. But
Overcook it.
the whole argument or the whole interpretation that he made the wrong kind of sacrifice doesn't seem right to me, because how would he have known what the right kind of sacrifice to make is?
That's what I'm saying.
Go back to chapter 3.
But just because God made skins for Adam and Eve doesn't mean that Cain and Abel knew that that's what they were supposed to do, was sacrifice animals and sacrifice the blood to provide worship to the Lord.
Sure they would have, and I'll tell you why. By this point, are Cain and Abel adults?
Yes.
Where would they have learned how to do anything?
Daddy.
Good old Dad. And where did Dad learn?
Good old God.
Because what was the first sacrifice we see in the Bible? God himself provided Adam and Eve with skins. Where did God get those
But
skins
it doesn't
from?
tell us that Abel and that Adam and Eve continued a practice of sacrifice that they would have passed on to their children. That doesn't happen until much later in the Bible, the practice of sacrifice.
On a regular basis, possibly. But we also are not told where did Adam and Eve learn to till the ground. Bible doesn't tell us. Do you think they figured it out the hard way, or did
No,
God
I
show
think
them?
they were taught either by God himself or by angels,
Okay.
messengers, but
Then where would they have learned to make a sacrifice? Same place.
but there's no
Just
record
because
of
there's
a
no
practice
record of it.
sacrifice being told, we're not being told about. So that's all. That, in my mind, is pure speculation on our part.
but there's some things that you basically, you're a Star Trek fan, right?
Yeah.
I know you are. You remember when the scene when they're looking for Kirk and Mr. Spock tells Mr. Sulu to start scanning the planet for where the captain has disappeared to. And Sulu basically tells him, well, there's no way to tell. And then Spock tells him, well, then if you can't figure where he is, start looking for where he isn't until you get down to there's nothing left. And of course, Mr. Sulu asks, the whole planet? And Spock just looks at him, yes, sir, the whole planet. If you can't figure out how they did it, then you figure out the opposite. You come at it from the other perspective. In this particular concept, no, the Bible doesn't tell us what they did, but you can look at what it doesn't tell us, and by process of elimination figure there's only one way left. God showed them, and then Adam would have had to have passed that information down to his sons. The same way you learned how to, do things. Where did you learn how to drive? Where did you learn how to eat? Where did you learn how to take care of yourself? You didn't have a written guide, but your parents taught you. And I don't even have to read the story of your life to know that. My common sense tells me that's where all of us learn stuff like this. Cain and Abel would have learned these things from Adam and Eve.
And the only source that they would have had would have been God.
And God Almighty. And whether God taught them himself or whether he sent an angel to teach them wouldn't have made any difference. Ultimately, it still came from God. Go ahead.
I was going to say, because Adam's continuing to make clothes and everything else, so he had to, basically, since he was taught that, the kids would have been there watching.
Yeah. And just like on Sunday night, we talked about the concept of tanning. If God made skins for them, if God did not teach them how to do tanning, it would have only been a few days before those skins that God provided them with would have been stinking and fall apart rotten. Bible doesn't tell us that God taught them anything about tanning, but guess what? There is no other option. God had to have taught them how to tan those skins, or they'd have fallen apart within days.
Till the field.
You have no other choice but even though those things that aren't specifically stated, there's only one way to answer it.
And I accept that, but I don't accept that Adam and Eve had already established a regular practice of making sacrifice.
But then your question there is, what constitutes a regular practice? Once a year, once every 10 years, once a week? We don't know.
Kind of like how
And
often,
even in the law of Moses, God only required them to go in and offer up the Passover sacrifice once a year, or the atonement once a year. There's certain other sacrifices you had them do, more often, but when you're talking about a regular sacrifice, there's no guideline at this point. It would have been up to what God told Adam and Eve to do. The fact that Moses did not write that down here for us doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just that at this point in history, do we need to know those details? No. Even the Israelites, by the time Moses wrote this down, didn't need to know that much detail. All they needed to know was that Adam and Eve were created, they sinned, and here's the result of it. But anyway, now back to the other possibility, because we can sit and dicker over that all day, but sooner or later, you're going to think about this and you're going to realize there is no other option. But
So you're saying that Cain's sacrifice was rejected because it was the wrong kind of sacrifice and not because he had
that's
a bad
one
attitude.
well, that's one thing. Now we're fixing to look at the other possibility. And the Bible does tell us this. Notice here, first off in verse 3, came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering. That's all it says. Doesn't say the first fruit, just brought an offering. And then when you drop down to verse 5, because of God's response to his offering, Cain gets mad. So what does that tell us about Cain's attitude in the whole process? Cain's begrudging all of
he
this.
felt slighted, or
Yeah. So Cain's got a bad attitude. Abel doesn't. We know Abel's got a good attitude about this because of two things. Abel not only provides the blood sacrifice, but Abel takes of the best that he's got, the firstborn of the flocks, and gives it to God. So, yes, you've got a contrast of attitudes. Abel's got a good attitude toward his sacrifice. Cain's just begrudging and mad about the whole situation. So there's two things at play here. Not only a sacrifice of fruit that does not involve a sacrifice of blood versus the blood sacrifice, but also the attitudes. Which one's right? My suggestion to you is probably both. Because if Cain had had a good attitude about it and brought the first fruit of his crop, and possibly having a good attitude, had bought a lamb, goat, whatever he was, herding there from Abel, God would have probably honored his sacrifice, but God didn't, because it wasn't a blood sacrifice. And keep in mind, what does it take to cover the sin? Fruit does not cover sin. It takes a blood sacrifice to cover the sin. God made that clear throughout the Old Testament. That's why I'm telling you that even if he had a good attitude, the fruit sacrifice or offering on its own would not have been acceptable, because you cannot atone for sin with fruit. It's got to be done with the loss of blood. Now, verse 6. Then the Lord said to Cain. Now notice, he does the same thing with Cain he did with Adam. He does not immediately confront Adam. First thing he does with Adam is, Adam, where are you? Then when Adam owns up to where he is, he says, did you do what I told you not to? Notice, God interrogated Adam, not with an accusation, but with questions to elicit from Adam a confession. Now, Adam, of course, we know first he blamed Eve, then he blamed God, but in the end, did Adam fess up to his sin?
Yes.
Yes. Begrudgingly, but Adam confessed. Notice Cain here. Lord says to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? And he goes on to tell us that if you do well, which tells us, if God says, if you do well, what does that imply at this point?
He didn't do well.
He didn't do well. Will not your countenance be lifted up, or will not you be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire. Notice the desire here, the same word back in chapter 3, where God told Eve that your desire will be for your husband. This is the same word here. It's an evil desire. It's a wanton lust desire. It says its desire is for you, but you must master it. So what God is telling us is that sin, the sin that is within us, wants us. It is eating away at us. It says, but he tells Cain, you've got to master it. Now, so the implication here is Cain wasn't doing well. He gave him, wrong sacrifice, wrong attitude. But also, there's one last point I want to make before we call it quits for the night.
He wasn't mastering it.
He wasn't.
God
Not at
wouldn't
this
have said
point.
that if he wasn't mastering it.
Was not. And I think that's kind of an obvious, but that's actually not the point I wanted to make here, but that is a good point. Notice it describes sin as sin is crouching at the door. Notice how God describes this. When it says sin is crouching at the door, what is the vision that brings up in our minds?
Something going to attack.
Say that louder.
Something is going to attack.
Right. Now,
Waiting to pounce.
Ready to pounce. Predation. Just like a lion that's about to jump on its prey. Now, if at this point there were no predatory animals, would Cain have understood what God was talking about when he said that sin is crouching? Sin is at the door, ready to pounce. If there was no predation going on at this point, would Cain have really understood the point? What does that tell us in all probability? See, this is one of those things where the Bible doesn't say it, but you've got no other choice but to look at it and consider the strong possibility.
The curse had already turned some
The
animals
curse
into predators.
had already turned some animals into predators at this point. They were already predating on each other because of the curse. Absolutely. And it was apparently common enough that Cain knew what God was talking about when he said sin was now crouching, waiting to get you.
And a shepherd wouldn't need to keep watch over a flock if there weren't wolves waiting to pounce on them.
Another good point.
So Abel wouldn't have needed to
There you
keep the
go.
flock.
He could just let them out there in the field and said, just, go reproduce and I'll come get the good ones when it's time. But he had to keep the flock, which again tells us predation at this point had already started in the animal kingdom. All right.